Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 132, I chat with Art Dudley, Tom Norton, and Andrew Robinson about the 2012 Rocky Mountain Audio Fest. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded October 15th, 2012. Episode 132, Rocky Mountain Audio Fest. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek. On today's episode, we have three home theater geeks and audiophiles who have just returned from the Rocky Mountain Audio Fest this past weekend. They are Art Dudley, the an editor-at-large at stereophile.com. Hey, Art, welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me here.
So glad to have you here after long travels back from Denver. Also, Tom Norton, a senior editor at hometheater.com. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Scott. How you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for being here. And finally, Andrew Robinson, the managing editor of hometheaterreview.com, and his first time on the show. Hey, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, for those of you who are watching live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv, can post questions for any of the gentlemen on the show today, and I'll be sure to pass along as many as I can. So we're talking about the Rocky Mountain Audio Fest, which is a pretty long-standing audiophile consumer show, right? I mean, it's for consumers, unlike CES or CEDIA, where end users really aren't normally welcomed in. But at this show, it's for consumers. Have I got that right, Tom?
That's correct. In fact, it's probably the biggest audio show for consumers in the U.S. currently.
Anybody have any idea how many people attended this year?
That I don't know. I do know it was pretty crowded.
Andrew?
I didn't know really what to expect because this was the first time I ever went this past weekend.
Okay. Well, I'm going to want to get your impressions in a second. Okay. Art, how did you feel about it? You've been there a number of times, haven't you?
No, actually, this was my first time also.
Oh, what do you know?
But subjectively, I was impressed with the traffic. It was very well attended, I thought. They were expecting approximately 500 different manufacturers, and there was really good traffic on the days I was there, and most of the rooms were crowded, so had a very good positive vibe. A lot of people there, a lot of audiophiles.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Now, what hotel was it at, Tom?
It was at the Marriott at the Denver Tech Center. Okay,
so fairly downtown, I guess?
Well, that's actually a fair amount away from downtown. Unless you have a car, you don't go downtown.
Okay. Art, I think you said there were supposed to be 500 manufacturers there, or distributors, dealers?
Yeah, nearly 500 manufacturers to be represented in, probably not quite that many different exhibit rooms. The number of rooms they didn't publish, but 500 different companies whose wares were on display and for the most part on demonstration there. Really, it's difficult for me to think of many who were left out. Virtually anybody I was interested in seeing was there, barring the vintage company.
Yeah. Now, as I understand it, this is a show primarily for two-channel audiophiles, and there wasn't much in the way of home theater, right, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really come across. I think SVS was the only room that had a multi-channel setup that I saw.
Yeah, SVS and Sue had a sort of a multi-channel setup mainly to demonstrate their subwoofers, but that was about it. And that was really what I expected. I mean, it's strictly pretty much a two-channel show.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd love each of you to comment on this whole notion of two-channel and how popular it remains. I mean, it seems to me that it should be a relatively niche market that not a lot of people can afford to get into very high-quality two-channel, and more people would be interested in watching movies and so on. And yet, the two-channel industry seems to be doing very well. Why do you suppose that is? Art, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's driven in part by the resurgence of interest in vinyl. And, there hasn't been any four-channel activity in vinyl since the days of SQ and all that back in the late 70s. But as younger people get more and more into vinyl and they're looking at buying used records and those new records that are still available, and they're looking for affordable turntables. So I think that has helped in a great measure to drive it. I mean, frankly, the only thing I was disappointed by was a really disheartening lack of mono. Apart from that, it was great.
Mono? Now, wait a second. Okay, Tom, what were you going to say?
Well, I would say that, yes, arts, I would agree with art to an extent as far as getting younger people involved in it. Vinyl is... Younger people, it seems to me, get interested in vinyl, not so much because, as many audiophiles feel, that it's superior in many ways, but simply because of the used record market, which makes music widely available and fairly cheap, other than if you don't want to go with downloads. So, but the heart of the two-channel audiophile market still remains older audiophiles that have been with it for decades.
Now, Andrew, you're a relatively young fellow. Do you consider yourself a two-channel audiophile?
No. Not really.
Okay.
And I would.
So why did you go to Rocky Mountain then?
Well, because I think it's in its 8th year, and I wanted to see it firsthand because it is a really popular show for the general public. But I'm not so sure that I agree 100% that vinyl is keeping two-channel alive. And the young people resurgence, it wasn't like I was walking the halls with people more my age. But I mean, it's definitely still very popular, two-channel. But at the same time, I think there's definite room for growth, and I do think there's also fear within that community as to what their next move is going to be.
Can you say any more about that? Where does this fear come from?
Well, honestly, the most overheard conversation that I heard walking the halls or in rooms with, among the audiophile manufacturers, outside of your main, I don't know, dozen or so that are readily available to consumers pretty much everywhere, was, what do we do? Like, what's the next thing for us? How do we, further sales? A lot of people thought that headphones are that new niche market, but unfortunately, in my opinion, I feel that a lot of these two-channel companies that are, really rooted in tradition are bringing old thinking to a new market in headphones, and they're starting to make even that market priced into the stratosphere of ridiculousness.
Speaking of price and headphones, what would you say about the representative range of prices? I mean, obviously, with two-channel audio, you can get into the stratosphere, as Andrew said. But was there any representation of really low-cost products that would be able to be purchased by younger people who might not have quite the discretionary income and still get a good performance out of it? Tom, did you see anything along those lines?
Yes, there was. I wouldn't say anything in the what you might call the dirt cheap market, but in budget audio, there was a fair amount of that sort of equipment. Mostly it was super high end. I mean, that tends to be the tendency of manufacturers to bring and feature their best stuff, which tends to, as Andrew just said, tends to be getting much more expensive than you would expect. But I mean, when you're talking about speakers that sell for over $30,000 or $40,000, it's getting to be you ask a manufacturer how much are these speakers, and it wasn't unusual to hear $20,000 a pair or more. But there were a fair number of we want to get down to discussing specific exhibits, but there were a reasonable number of affordable items shown.
Well, I do want to get down to specific exhibits, and I hope you guys will help me with that, because obviously I wasn't there. But so, for example, Tom, what comes to mind when you think of reasonably priced systems that sounded good to your ears?
I would start with Aperions. I reviewed their Grand Vera speakers about a year ago in a surround system, and they sounded as good as I remember them. And the left and right speakers, which they were only showing, and they had a center there, but it wasn't hooked up when I was there, and they didn't have any video, but it was just a 2-channel setup with driven with Marantz integrated amplifier, not a cheap one, but an integrated amplifier and a Marantz CD player. And I didn't check the price on the Marantz gear, but those speakers are under $2,000 a pair.
Yeah, well, that's certainly not unreasonable when you count that there are speakers, as you pointed out, that are $50,000-$60,000 a pair and more. Art, what did you see that you thought was a good value?
Well, there's one Swedish company in particular, and their name is almost unpronounceable. The best estimate I heard of it is Hofen, but it's spelled SFOJN. Maybe the symbol for argon after that. Who knows? But it's a peculiar little company. And now Tom's point was correct. I think the idea, especially when you have a smaller manufacturer who's exhibiting at a show like this, they don't have the budget to bring everything, and they want to impress. They want to bring the most expensive thing in the line. But Hofen was one of the rare companies that decided to impress by bringing one of the least expensive items in their line, and they brought a new loudspeaker that they called the Clue, as in get a clue. And it was $999 for a pair, so certainly not dirt cheap by the standards of, the average consumer who's not into this hobby, but quite affordable in the context of perfectionist audio. It was a small 2-way stand-mounted speaker, and it was fantastic. I've heard this company's products before, and they emphasize a good, impactful sound with good presence, good stereo imaging. It's a 2-channel intensive company. And the company is also known for bringing music to demonstrate with that doesn't fall into the typical audiophile recording latrine. In other words, there was no jazz at the pawn shop or junk like that. They even brought a Rammstein recording, and that sounded fantastic. If you're familiar with that German group, it emphasizes power. It's very impactful music, and it sounded fantastic. It was a great, fun speaker.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make a point here, Scott, about that situation. That it seems to be one of the good things about the audio shows that are popping up all over the country. There's 3 or 4 of them around right now throughout the year. Is that it lets audiophiles get a chance to hear stuff that they might not be able to hear anywhere else. The bad thing is they may not be able to hear it or buy it anywhere else. As a company that Art just mentioned, I had never heard of them before, and I don't even know how many dealers they might have.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point, and certainly one that I wanted to touch upon here today. So many of us, all of us really, always recommend in our reviews of speakers and other products, other audio products, that you really want to go hear them for yourself. But you can't always do that because the dealer might not be nearby or whatever. So maybe you go to an audio show like Rocky Mountain, and you might be able to hear it where you otherwise wouldn't. That's a good thing, as you said, but what about the acoustics of a hotel room? How can that possibly show these products off in their best light? Andrew, did you have any sense of the acoustics of the hotel room and how that was helping or hurting the cause?
Well, real quick to your earlier point about a place where people can come and hear products because maybe there's not a dealer. You also have to be somewhat cautious because a lot of the products that show up at these shows are, in fact, like one-offs. Like they're bringing all they have. So it is kind of a catch-22. With regards to like show or hotel room acoustics, I think show and hotel room acoustics are amazing in communicating to the listener what it is that they have a reasonable expectation to get in their home, because not everyone is willing to fully treat their room or has the perfect, golden mean dimensions. Some people live with coffee tables and TVs. So I really look to shows to kind of give me a real world playback or listening experience of a product. Because if you can sound good in a hotel room, it's only going to get better if you take the time and the care to outfit your listening room in your house, that much better.
That's a great point.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, sorry to stop on you there. No, that's an excellent point, because in the days when there were more bricks and mortar stores and what we call high-end salons, I guess is distinguished from stores, it wasn't unusual to find a store that was selling expensive equipment that had a very similarly expensive demonstration room. But there was always the concern that, somebody goes in and hears a pair of speakers or whatever in a room like that. There's very little chance that they're going to get that same caliber of sound with that product in their home. Their home is not, again, perfectly proportioned. So when you go to hear it in a hotel room where, just 24 hours before the equipment was set up, somebody was schlepping beds and dressers out of the room, and you've got potted plants and the dimensions are imperfect, well, at least what you hear there, you're not going to do much worse than that. And with a little care, you may do better. So it really is a good real world basis for comparison, for evaluating these things.
And if I may add on to that, manufacturers need to actually stop making apologies for the acoustics of the room. In my opinion, you're showing in a hotel. These trade shows are never anything new in terms of the logistics. So if you know your environment, you know your battle, don't make apologies before you hit play. Let your product speak for itself.
Very good point. Very good point. And I hadn't thought of that. All of this that you guys are talking about, I had never thought of before, that in fact it does present a more real world picture of what it's going to sound like than it would in some super treated room. So that's a great point, and one that I will certainly keep in mind.
Well, there is an irony in this, of course, when you're talking about the really high end, super high end of the market. You're talking about, say, let's say a pair of speakers that cost $20,000, $30,000 a pair. You want to get the best you can out of those speakers when you get them home. I mean, you're spending that kind of money. Why settle for the average room? But unfortunately, most people that are in the market for those kind of speakers aren't willing to do the sort of things in their room that they need to do to get the best out of them.
You mean somebody who's going to spend $20,000, $30,000 on a pair of speakers isn't going to treat their room?
No, because they have an interior decorator that tells them you can't do that.
Well, here we get to the point about, and one of the differences between home theater and two-channel audiophilia, if I may call it that, which is that in a home theater, it seems to me much more likely that an interior designer is going to get in the way of treating the room acoustically or visually so that you get the best performance out of the audio and video equipment, whereas two-channel buffs might very well say to their interior designer, you can have the rest of the house. This room is mine.
Okay. There was a seminar on the first day of the show about how do we get high-end, more people interested in high-end audio, and the moderator was Ken Kessler from the UK, and he pointed out an interesting anecdote about something that he'd heard from either from a friend or indirectly in the UK about a situation where a quite expensive speaker was installed in a system, and the interior designer decided to spray paint the whole speaker a different color.
What? Man!
I hope he didn't spray paint the front.
Yeah, really?
Right.
I would argue.
Yes, go ahead, Art.
It was me.
Oh, no.
Sorry, Andrew. Andrew, go right ahead.
I would actually argue that you had mentioned that home theater might impact a room more or create more difficulties. I would actually venture to say that home theater is much more forgiving of the room because home theater enthusiasts have embraced things like on walls, in walls, sound bars, and things like that with regards to speakers, whereas two-channel purists seem to really like these two speakers out far away from the walls with lots of room from the side walls. They try and follow all the various placement things that they read about either in books or online and whatnot. And they may even go so far as to buy a bass trap or two. But in terms of living with the system, I actually feel that living with more speakers in a home theater type configuration is actually less impactful upon a living space.
As long as I guess they're not sitting out in the middle of the room.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true. And you could take that a step further and say that the home theater audience has probably embraced digital signal processing, more thoroughly than the two-channel audio community, where, there are some purists, myself included, who really wouldn't want something like that in the chain. So, but of course, it's a sliding scale. Yeah, different audiophiles appreciate different sorts of loudspeakers. There are some of the loudspeakers I own are designed to be in the corners. So, they use the room for a little bit of gain, and, their frequency response is tailored for, that sort of bass reinforcement. So there, and some people will gravitate toward dipoles, which pose certain problems and have certain rewards. So there's a pretty good scale of choices available to people.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned digital audio processing and digital signal processing, and I wanted to ask about the presence of digital audio as opposed to analog audio at the show. Analog audio being primarily LPs, records, vinyl. Although at least at one or two shows that I've been to recently, there was one company, I forget who it was, who actually was playing analog tape.
United Hi-Fi.
There were actually a couple of those at this particular show, too. I can't recall the rooms, but there were a couple of tape decks at the show.
Yeah, and probably a lot of vinyl, I would guess. But what would you say was the proportion of analog to digital? And by digital, I would be talking, I don't imagine many were playing CDs, but they might have been playing 9624 audio from a computer or maybe SACD or something like that. Art, what would you estimate in terms of what you saw was the balance of those two?
It was still mostly digital, and as you said, mostly people playing music files. It would probably be easier to guess the proportion of Macs to PCs. It was mostly Mac as far as that was concerned. If I had to guess at the proportion of digital music sources to analog music sources, I'd say 70-30 off the top of my head.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that a lot of rooms were, as you say, playing off of computer files, and they were using that as their primary source, with like an iPad or something like that as a remote to choose the selections that they had loaded on their server. I would say that I find that frustrating development of show, and some manufacturers do that, and they don't even provide another source such as a CD player. So if you want to bring some of your own music and play it, they can't do it.
Mm. Andrew, what was your estimation of this?
Well, I thought it was kind of evenly split in terms of like the old school analog. I was shocked by the number of reel-to-reel players that I saw, although a couple companies went so far as to like pimp them out a little bit, which was pretty cool. But outside of that, I saw a lot of netbooks and music server type products running a barrage of things from like Amara to Apple to J River. A lot of J River stuff, which actually made me really happy.
Now, J River, I can't say I sort of think I recognize that name, but not entirely. Tell us a bit about it.
That's the skin for a PC, right? For
using J River's a Media Center PC program.
Oh, of course, of course.
It's not a skin so much because it offers a lot of the functionality of like Amara and whatnot, but it costs way less.
Amara's come down quite a bit in price. It's under $200 now for their top model.
Yeah, J River's $50.
I'm sorry, Tom. Which was this one now?
The Amara has come down to below $200 for their top offering. It used to be $600 or $700.
Ah, and Andrew, J River's down around that same region?
No, J River costs $50.
Oh, even better.
And you can use it on all your computers.
Right. So we were hearing mostly digital. Oh, I know that. What I was going to ask you, Tom. You often bring your own material to play at these shows because you're familiar with it, and that's something that I think we would all agree is something that when you do get a chance to audition an audio system, if you can, you want to play music that you are familiar with, so that you can tell what's going on with a system. Was there much opportunity to do that, Tom?
I got a chance to do it in about 5 or 6 of the rooms that I was interested in enough in what they were playing that it was worthwhile to put my own stuff on. Occasionally, it's a problem with the show because occasionally you'll go into a room where someone is playing some god awful sounding piece of whatever, and you run screaming from the room, and might have been a particularly good system, but you didn't get a chance to hear it because of the software being used. And I think some manufacturers, they're not quite so much anymore, but they used to be a little bit squirrely about letting people play their own stuff because they didn't know what to expect.
Art, do you typically bring some of your own stuff to play?
I often do. I neglected to do on this trip for a number of reasons. But to pick up on Tom's point, it's true that you're well off. You're well advised to bring your own material. But some people will be focusing on the sound, and so they want a good sounding recording as opposed to something of any great musical worth that they might respond to. For me, I tend to gravitate toward things that are that I know will be musically satisfying more so than well recorded to audiophile standards. I mean, it's true now as it was 25 years ago. A recording of Swedes playing Dixieland jazz is never going to be satisfying to me on any level. So,
except possibly the YouTube video of that Swedish group outdoors in a barn playing Sweet Georgia Brown with a tractor playing the drum part. That is so hilarious. I watch it still and laugh every time.
That has a lot. I
like to interject on the same vein for people who go to future shows. If you go into a room this offering system or speakers or whatever that you really want to hear, or that you think might be worth spending some time with, and it sounds awful, and if those speakers have a good reputation in the system, for instance, come back later because it might have just been the material that was being played.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think? Did you take any of your own content you were familiar with?
I always carry with me something that I'm familiar with, but I normally carry it either on a smartphone or some sort of digital player. And I discovered very quickly that either A, people weren't willing to let me play it, or B, their products wouldn't allow for that type of connectivity. And as a person who's trying to progress the hobby and look at things that real consumers and feature sets that consumers are really going to need, it's kind of a strike against you if you can't connect Bluetooth or via some sort of USB or dongle type device.
It's a very good point. Tom, did you bring CDs or Blu-rays? What did you bring with you?
I brought a couple of CDRs with a variety of stuff on them, which I've used quite a bit in the past, and brought a couple of Blu-rays, and I actually got a chance to play one for about 10 minutes.
Well, I do know that, Tom, you have a long-standing reputation for bringing your own material, and I know a lot of companies will hold their room open for you or open it for you special after hours so you can do a little more listening. You didn't get much of a chance to do that this time, huh?
No, not this show. Not that happens more. That happens more at a trade show than at a consumer show.
Right, understood. Caffeine-Free Dave in the chat room is pointing to a video on YouTube of a guy installing a 2-channel system in a room, and I'd like for people to maybe check it out, but it's got a long URL, of course. So, Caffeine-Free Dave, if you can, when you're in the chat room, give me a word or a phrase to search for in YouTube that people can just go to and land on that. I'd love to promote that and get people to check it out. While I'm waiting for Caffeine-Free Dave, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Netflix. Of course, Netflix lets you stream thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to your TV or your smartphone or your tablet or your game console or your Blu-ray player. Just about any consumer electronics device made today has a Netflix app that lets you stream its vast library of streaming content directly to any of those devices you want. You can even start on one device and finish on another if you want, the ultimate inconvenience. And there's no limit. You can stream as much as you want for one low monthly rate. Even better, TWiT listeners get a 30-day free trial. Just go to netflix.com/twit and sign up for a 30-day free trial to see how much you will enjoy streaming thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to any device that you might have in your possession. That's netflix.com/twit. And we thank Netflix very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks and the entire TWiT network. So another issue that I wanted to cover with you guys is one of loudness or volume. When I've gone to trade shows like this, or consumer shows in this case, some of the rooms are painfully loud. And I'm not entirely sure why they do that other than to show off that they can. Art, what was your experience of the volume levels at the show? Did you come across any that were simply intolerable?
No, and I was pleasantly surprised by that fact, because normally I agree with you. I've been horrified by the levels at which they play some program material at these shows. The last show in New York in April of this year was just horrible in that regard. And I don't know if they were trying to attract people from the hall into their room or what, but it was pointless, and it was destructive, and it was harmful to my hearing. This show impressed me as being better, and even I would say that there were some manufacturers whose demonstrations I found offensive in that regard in the past, who had turned it down a little bit. So whether they just got the message, I don't know, but I thought it was pretty reasonable for the show. I wasn't in pain at all.
Very good, Andrew. How about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I thought it was pretty, everyone had a kind of healthy level of respect for the rooms around it. I mean, you're always fighting that ambient noise floor that bleeds in from the room adjacent. But rather than trying to beat your neighbor into submission with SPL, I felt everyone just kind of kept it really chill. So I would agree. Yeah,
great. Tom, did you find the same?
Same thing. I agree.
Now, Tom, you always bring earplugs. I know. I do, too. What about you, Andrew? Did you think to bring earplugs to the show just in case?
I never have to any show, and I guess if it's too loud, I just leave.
That's true, too. I tend to bring earplugs, but I'd rather leave than use them, because that's the worst insult you can give to a demonstrator, is to pull out your earplugs.
Yeah, that's true.
You can
Art, what about you?
Worse. Yeah, my wife won't let me leave the house without them, especially if I'm going to an audio show. And Tom, you're right, but you can stuff big wads of Kleenex into your ears and make the insult even more insulting. And sometimes that's.
Kleenex is actually a very poor earplug, but anyway.
Yeah.
Well, right, exactly. Okay, so let's see. I'm still waiting for that search for. Here's Caffeine-Free Dave. Bowers & Wilkins, B&W 801D. The Search for Grail, Act 2. And the short link is bit.ly/ capital R, lower YS, 0R, capital C. So anyway, look for Bowers & Wilkins, B&W 801D, and search for the Grail, Act 2. In fact, here is, if you're watching the video at all, you can see, thanks to our wonderful engineer, John, Jammer B, that he has found that video, and we're taking a look at it here, and there are the 801s, and that's quite an impressive-looking room, not one that has a very high wife acceptance, or I should say spouse acceptance factor. There's a question for you guys. Obviously, this hobby is primarily male. I mean, I don't know. Did you see any females there other than partners of audiophiles who are being dragged along? Art, what did you see in that regard?
Hard to tell. It's often hard to distinguish between the partner and the self-sufficient female audiophile. But I would have to say I don't think I saw any audio enthusiasts who were women. The women I saw, they seemed to enjoy themselves. They were enjoying the music, but my guess was that they were all there as partners of male audiophiles, and that's too bad. Physiologically, women have better hearing, especially as people age. Women tend to maintain more upper frequency response. So, let's tick them off. They hear better. They're sensitive to art. They're, it's a shame that we don't see more women in audio, and that in itself could take several 1-hour episodes to explain, and we wouldn't come away with the truth of it.
Yeah, exactly right. Andrew, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, there was barely any women there, and if they were either with the manufacturers or with someone that drug them there against their will.
Of course, there are a lot of women in the PR end of things, which might be explainable in one way or another. But in terms of hobbyists themselves, it's true there aren't very many. I'm seeing a number of things in here. Oh yeah, Hermes is saying Ted Nugent, loudest concert ever. Ears still ringing from 1979. We've been talking a lot about speakers. Uh-oh, somebody's phone's ringing.
Just shut it off.
Yeah, thank you. But what about other components? Clearly there were amplifiers, there were preamps, probably there were source devices. Art, you mentioned that there probably wasn't much in the way of signal processing, right?
Right. Not that I, paid attention to. I saw a lot of source components that were new to me in the analog field. Of course, obviously, I'm looking for that sort of thing. If I can mention, there was one really interesting tone arm. I mean, the idea that people are still producing new tone arm designs in 2012 is something that pleases me. It might distress others. But there's a company or an individual called Schroeder. A man named Frank Schroeder lives in Germany. He is or was a watchmaker, so he's qualified to make, small fiddly things. And he had a new tone arm. We're probably all familiar with the distinction between a pivoting tone arm and a linear tracking tone arm, the latter of which follows the same tangent to the groove as the mechanism that cut the master for that record in the first place. And Schroeder has created what, as far as I know, is the first pivoting linear tracking tone arm. It's difficult to describe, but the base of it was
Oh, darn! We just missed him.
Articulated record.
I'm sorry, Art. Can you repeat a bit about your description there? We just got a picture of it on the screen, and we lost your audio at the same time. So let's get that picture back up.
That's okay.
And
if you can hear me, that picture actually wasn't the arm. That was a Schroeder arm, but Schroeder makes a number of different models, and this new one looks a little bit different to that. But again, it has two pivots. The arm itself pivots, and its base pivots in a manner that I don't really understand the geometry behind it. But he was using the movement of one to enable the movement of the other, in a way that it kept it tangential at a perfect right angle to the groove, all the way from the outermost groove to the innermost groove.
Well, I've often cool. That sounds pretty cool. I've always been of the opinion that the tangential tracking arm, which stays at a constant angle and the entire arm moves from the outer groove to the inner groove, although that's a bit of a misnomer since there is only one groove. that was a pretty cool idea, and in fact that is how the record is cut. Tom, did you hear this? Did you see the Schroeder arm?
No, I missed that.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Went clear over his head. Okay. All right. What do you guys think? Speaking of turntables, I have to ask you this question. It may be a little off topic, but I remember at one point many years ago, I saw an ad for a turntable in which the pickup was a laser that tracked the groove and read the reflections off the wiggly parts inside the groove to recreate the music. Have you guys ever seen that? Have you ever heard it? Was it any good? Was it a good idea?
I can comment. I can't say I really heard it, but I've seen it. I can't recall the name. It was produced by some manufacturer, and then I think the rights were sold to someone else. And it was talked about in the audio press about, I don't know, maybe it's 15 years ago for a few months, but it never really went anywhere. There may have been a lot of problems. It also may have been killed off by the lack of interest, because it's basically, it's like there's a laser tracking a CD. So most of the people in the market said, well, what do I want that for? Except for the high-end audiophiles, and it wasn't good enough for them.
Yeah.
Art, did you have any experience with it?
Yeah, I've heard it. It was developed back in 1983 or 84, and it was one of those things where the company that developed it put so much money into the development that they didn't really have enough left to manufacture and market it. So to make a long story short, the rights to the design went through more hands than the Shroud of Turin. And the last time it surfaced, it was sold in a package, and this is instructive. It was sold in a package with a record cleaner. You couldn't buy the laser disc player without buying a record cleaner also, indicating that, yeah, the thing was pretty sensitive to dust. And it was, I was not impressed with the sound. It was sort of pallid and weak and dynamically compressed. It didn't have the sorts of things that I consider the good points of vinyl. So it was an answer to a question that nobody was really asking in the first place.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Here's a question from Web6487 in the chat room. He has a home theater receiver. It's about 5 years old. Whenever it seems over the years that he has to keep turning the volume up to play the same content. The question is, and it relates to any amplifier, do amps, quote, wear out over time? Do they change? Over 5 years, I would think that's pretty, that you wouldn't expect that. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, they shouldn't change in that respect. I mean, they should be just as loud as ever, unless maybe he's been playing it too loud and his hearing has been getting progressively worse.
Well, there is that possibility.
But,
Andrew, what do you... I'm sorry, Tom, you weren't finished. Pardon me. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Andrew, what do you have to say on this? Anything?
I would think that something that's well built and 5 years of age shouldn't do that, but not knowing his listening habits or not knowing any direct or indirect abuses that he may have put upon it or what speakers he's even driving. I know a lot of people that buy like Magnapans and then insist on putting them on a Denon receiver. It's like, you're going to cook something. So it's hard to really give him solid advice from that perspective.
Understood.
I guess to that I'd add has he changed speakers in the last since he made this observation? I mean, speakers vary in he and it could be he's used to like setting the volume at 10 o'clock, and he set it at 10 o'clock, and all of a sudden his new speakers are less efficient and it's not playing as loud. So he thinks there's something wrong with the amp, and really it's just the different speakers.
Oh, that's very good. With less efficiency, there would be less volume for a given amount of power.
Right.
Okay, I want to ask each of you. Oh, sorry, Art, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, and I hope this doesn't sound insulting, but the answer could very well be psychoacoustic. I mean, when somebody first gets into music, especially recorded popular music, it might not be apparent to them how compressed most of it is. And as one becomes a more sophisticated listener, one probably gets a little bit frustrated with that subconsciously. There's something in there that you want to get out that the compression is preventing you from getting out. It's called excitement and dynamics, and I can very well see it where, especially with popular music, after 5 or 6 years, you're going to begin to think things are not as loud as they used to be.
Good point. Good point. Eric in Michigan is asking, for amplifiers, do you have to trade features for quality? Now, amplifiers don't really have too many features, right? I mean, they just amplify. But in general, I'll ask this question in general. For audio equipment, particularly I would guess preamps is where most of the features are, or surround processors in the case of home theater, do you have to trade quality for features? Andrew, let's start with you.
I don't think so at all, honestly. I think some of the more exciting full-featured products out there today happen to be affordable and, of a really high caliber. I'm an individual that is fortunate enough that I review enough and I can kind of get my hands on whatever I want. But, my AV preamp of choice, retails for, I think, $24.99, and it's from Integra. So, you don't have to spend a lot to get a lot. You don't have to sacrifice anything. Everything in this day and age has gotten to the point where we're just our baseline is just really, really solid. So don't think that you have to, take that second mortgage if you could even get it. Don't think you have to take a second mortgage out to be a part of this hobby.
Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I'd also say that the features actually, in some respect, especially today with most of the features on, for instance, on AV receivers are digital anyway. That you don't the features aren't the most expensive part of the product. Power supplies and everything else adds up to a lot more. One of the reasons you see fewer features in high-end audiophile equipment, such as preamps and integrated amplifiers, is that the attitude that the features are going to get in the way of the sound. In other words, you put all that extra circuitry, the simpler the better. And there's something to be said for that, but I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of things, for instance, it's been years since most preamps have had tone controls, probably decades. And that's because of that attitude. That's something else in the circuit that you really don't want there. Take it out because it'll sound better, and it might. But it depends on the particular piece of gear, of course. It's not a generic truth.
If I could add something?
Please.
Also, beware a lot of the features that some of these products have. You're going to start doubling up, where your source might have the same feature set as your AV preamp, as receiver or whatever you have in your system. So, in some instances, you may actually be looking for products that have fewer features because you're getting them either at your display or at your source, as I said. So. There is such a thing as too much, but not because, I'm not saying that because of price issues.
Right. That's a good point. Art, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm the rare two-channel audiophile who still likes tone controls. I think anyone who is going to buy an expensive product deserves to have exactly what they want in whatever combination. And in a general sense, there's really no need to give up features. I mean, Tom is right in what he was saying. The key word in what Tom was saying is attitude. There was an attitude propounded by the industry that sort of perpetuated that myth that if you want the ultimate in sound, you have to give up tone controls. That might have been true at one point. Some crude tone shaping circuits might have induced phase shift that could have been audible and could have stood between you and what you wanted to hear out of the music. But if executed well, it can be done perfectly nicely. As you probably know, I'm into tube electronics, and I prefer that sound and that presentation. So if you wanted to look at it this way, you could say, well, there's a little bit of a lack of convenience in those when the tubes go bad and you need to buy new ones, and hopefully you can still find them. So in as much as that's concerned, yeah, I suppose that stands in the way. But in a general sense, you shouldn't have to give up anything.
Very good. Let's see. So Cal Ray Jr. in the chat room, our good friend, is asking what you guys think of the whole idea of high-end or exotic cables. Now, this is a whole show in and of itself, and I had Noel Lee on last week talking about Monster, obviously, but things can get a lot more expensive than even his most expensive cables. Art, let me start with you. What is your overall philosophy on the whole issue of exotic cables and how much they improve the performance of a system?
In my opinion, cables are and always will be an accessory. They're not components unto themselves. Cables can and do make a difference, but I recently wrote an editorial that was published in Stereophile, and forgive me, I forget if it was the September or October issue. The editorial was titled Skin Deep, and I said, it's time to put an end to the idea that there can possibly be such a thing as an interconnect cable that's worth as much as a new car. And a lot of people will laugh. See, there you go. It's a funny proposition. But it's not only occasionally true, it's becoming prevalent. Cables with 5-figure prices it's nonsense, and it's time to roll that back quite a ways, I think.
Andrew, what do you think?
I would agree with that. I think cables for me have always been an accessory. The people that will sit there and say, I had these lists of problems with my particular setup, and then I bought these new cables, and now everything's perfect. I call BS on that. It's like, it's that last, 1 or 2%. It's not, the last 80. Right. So I would agree. they don't deserve to cost as much as a Hyundai. And honestly, I look at the speaker cable manufacturers, and they all offer product that is inexpensive, and and they stand by that product, and they tout it very highly. And why would they do that, if it wasn't something that provided results for people?
Good point. Absolutely. Tom, how about you?
Yes, I have a variety of cables that I use interchangeably depending on on the needs of the moment or the product I'm reviewing. Some of it has been around for several years. I've got some Cardis cables that inherited from my days from reviewing at Stereophile that go back to 1990. Good Cardis cables, but from way back when. I have a little problem with using super expensive cables, if for no other reason than if I'm reviewing a home theater surround speaker system, and I use super expensive cables. The reader would have a right to ask, well, do I have to buy those cables for it to sound that good? So
very good point.
And plus, when you're talking about a home theater and you're talking about expensive cables, it adds up really fast when you're talking about 5 channels instead of 2.
Good point. Absolutely, especially when the surrounds are fairly far from the preamp or from the amplifier.
It's like when
you've got to get long cables.
Yeah.
Holy smokes. Okay. Well, listen, in the last few minutes, I want each of you to tell me what you heard. There's nothing to talk about seeing since there was no home theater there. What you heard, what was your favorite audio demo? What sounded the best to you? Art, let's start with you.
I'll name 2 quickly. Wilson Audio introduced a new loudspeaker called the Alexia, and they partnered with the American electronics company VTL. They make mostly tube electronics and a spiral groove turntable and DCS digital components, and they made a tremendous sound. It was a really impressive speaker. Very music. It didn't just sound good; it made music well. And then at a slightly cheaper end of the spectrum, the American company DeVore Fidelity introduced a new loudspeaker called the O93, the 93 in this case referring to the sensitivity. It's a loudspeaker made for lovers of low-powered amplifiers such as myself. The price was in the $8,000 range. Again, most American consumers would consider that expensive, but by perfectionist audio standards, it's not so bad, and that sounded lovely. It was a very, very nice loudspeaker.
How much for the Wilsons?
Yeah, I skipped over that, didn't I? That was a $48,000 pair.
I'm sorry, say again, please.
Yeah, I know. $48,500 a pair.
And that doesn't include the electronics or anything else. That's just the speakers, right?
That's just the loudspeakers, and that's certainly priced well out of my range. But again, we live in a world where that's far from the most expensive. So make of that what you will. But they sounded lovely, and it's a good company. It's a company that's been around a while and has made a name for itself as sort of the high-end audio's Ferrari.
Right. I would agree with that. Wilson Audio. I'll tell you a quick story about a Stereophile show I went to years and years ago. I was walking down the hall, and I heard music coming out of one of the hotel rooms, as I'm sure you guys did this weekend. And I remember my first thought so clearly, what are they doing with live musicians in there? Now, keep in mind that I'm a professional musician. And I looked in the room, and there were no live musicians. It was Wilson Audio. So they were the only company so far to actually fool me into thinking that there was live music going on when in fact there wasn't. So I certainly appreciate their quality immensely. Tom, what was your pick of the show?
Well, actually, I'll do one up and mention 3. At the high end of it was kind of a close call, but I'd have to choose Joseph Audio's updated their Pearl. They call the Pearl 3.
And what type of component is this?
The speaker. These are all speakers.
Speaker.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. Joseph Audio Pearl 3, and it's a floor standing speaker. For those familiar with the original Watt Puppy, the configuration is Wilson Watt Puppy. The configuration is very similar, but it's completely different design, of course. And they were $28,500, which I guess is getting to be kind of mid-range for super high-end stuff these days. In the middle ground, I can't give you a price on it because they weren't giving a price. Sony has a new pair of speakers. Audiophiles that might be listening might be familiar with some super high-end speakers that Sony's been marketing the last couple of years that have gotten very good reviews. These are a little smaller. They're going to be called under the ES range. They didn't have a specific model number, but they're floor standard, I'd say about roughly 3 feet high, and they sounded excellent. They're not available yet. They're not going to be formally launched until CES, and they should be available early next year. And the interesting thing about the Sonys is that that particular line will have center channels and surround, so it can be used for a home theater setup. And at the bottom end, I'll just mention the Aperion Veris Grand, which I mentioned earlier in the show.
Yeah, and I have to say I'm really happy to hear you mention Aperion because Leo Laporte, the chief TWiT here at TWiT, just bought an Aperion system for his home theater setup, and I told him it was going to be a good deal, and I'm glad to hear you saying that you thought those sounded really good. Okay, so Andrew, your pick for the show.
I had a couple, none of them ultra high end because I think it's kind of ridiculous. I'll second the Aperion room. I thought that was really good. I liked the Wired for Sound room. I thought they did some pretty interesting things, and they were playing music that I believe people have actually heard before. Zoo Audio was a fun time.
By the way, Wired for Sound is WYRED, numeral 4, sound. And they're primarily an amplifier company, right?
Amplifier, they make a wonderful DAC that also doubles as a preamp. They have a music server now, and they were demonstrating the whole lineup, and it's very compact components, kind of, I hate to say Bel Canto-ish, because they're far more affordable than Bel Canto, and they provide the same level of performance. So I really liked that room just because of the accessibility of it, the openness of the people there. I mean, you could make suggestions, requests. They would actually let you play your own music. It was a really fun time, and Zoo Audio is always a fun time. I thought some of their new stuff, forgive me, I don't remember the names off the top of my head, also sounded terrific. Trying to think what else, and I draw a blank.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about Wired for Sound. One last thought before we go, is that if I'm not mistaken, Wired for Sound, their amplifiers are Class D, what we essentially call digital amps. Are they still in that purview?
Yes, they are. It's all Class D amplification, and they can be ordered in various configurations. They kind of have a modular thing going on where you can get, a 2-channel and 250 or 500 watt configurations, and then they'll just keep outfitting it. You get 5, 7 channels, and so on and so forth.
Right. So we've sort of come to the opposite end of the spectrum from Art, who has a preference for tube amps, low-power tube amps, which are highly inefficient, but provide a distinctive sonic signature that's very different from Class D. Art, what do you think about Class D amps?
I think I believe it's possible to make a good-sounding musical amplifier using any technology. I haven't yet heard a Class D amp that has appealed to me, but I see no reason why not. I like my tube amps because they provide the sound that I like, but I'm open to the suggestion that that sound could be provided by literally any technology.
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was going to say I'm also a fan of low-powered or single-ended triode tubes. My company of choice is I like Deckware, which they don't go to these types of shows. They're internet direct. But I have found that the latest crop of like the digital amplifiers are getting really close to a lot of the nuances and the things that people who are fans of SET really like. There's just kind of this effortless, neutral, spacious quality to these new crops of digital amps. I've reviewed Wired for Sound. I have Red Dragon Audio in my rack right now. And then, I've done a bunch of professional amplifiers that use some form of kind of digital topology.
Well, and that's certainly the topic for an entire show, which perhaps you guys will join me for. Until then, I want to thank you all three of you very much for being on the show. Andrew, thanks so much. Your first time on the show. I hope the first of many.
Thank you very much.
And Tom, you've been back with us a few times, and I look forward every time you're on because you always have great things to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott.
And Art, Dudley, your first time on the show as well, and I hope, again, the first of many.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Andrew and Tom also. Thank you.
You bet. So you can read more about what each of these guys is doing. Art Dudley on stereophile.com, Tom Norton on hometheater.com, and Andrew Robinson on hometheaterreview.com, and also on his own website, andrew-robinson-online.com. So next week, my guest geeks are scheduled to be Tyle Hertzens and Steve Guttenberg. Now, both of these guys have been on the show before, separately, talking about the relationship and the validity or value of objective measurements versus subjective listening. And next week, they're going to be on together to duke it out because they have differing opinions on that balance and on those values. So it should be a very interesting show, and I hope you will join me for that. Until then, geek out.